Hey guys, I wanted to do a quick tutorial on how to do Supersaws. Supersaws. I actually made like a short little track just now, not a full track, but just sort of a quick pattern. You can give it a listen. And I made this only with Supersaws, only saws to be more precise. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to sort of share how you can do stuff with Supersaws, what they are. This is mainly aimed at beginners. This will be a short one. Uh, yeah, let's get started. Uh, so I'm going to sort of break down what I made here and focus on different sounds. Uh, so we can listen to the first sound I made. Which is this. And then the second sound I made is this. Oops. And the third sound. Without a filter, it sounds like this. And this is a cute little lead I made. And these are all saws, as you can see. They're all using the default saw for Serum. So you can actually do quite a lot with saws. With basic waveforms, you can make a ton of stuff. And sure, I want to also show you real quick sort of what a saw sounds like if you're new to production. Maybe you don't know what a saw is. A saw is a type of waveform that looks like this. It looks like a saw. There are other waveforms. There's tons of other waveforms, but common ones that you'll see are the sine, which is, like the trigonometric sine. You have, this is also a saw. You can just see that it's been shifted so that the sharp part is at the end of the beginning. This is a triangle. Sounds like that. This is a square. And then you have sort of rectangular pulses. And you have this weird sort of saw-like, triangle-like thing. But I want to focus on the saw because it's used very commonly, sort of everywhere. And it sounds like this. If you just search up on YouTube, any feature-based song, for example, will have a bunch of Supersaws, any trance song, basically all of EDM. This is a bunch of saws and Supersaws. I don't want to play something right now so I don't get copyright striked. But yeah, the way you usually make a supersaw. So a supersaw is usually just a bunch of saws together, and they're all a little bit detuned. Usually sounds like this. And usually you'll do a bunch of different sort of effects to get these to sound like what I have here. So for example, we'll start with this first one. And this one is just like what I showed you, except firstly it's two oscillators. So these oscillators are each like separate voices. Each oscillator has, an oscillator with unison is an oscillator that has multiple voices, but an oscillator is sort of like one, super voice. An oscillator is sort of like one, module that you can sort of manipulate. Whereas these voices in unison are just sort of clones of each other, which because they're detuned, they're actually off from each other a little bit randomly. But aside from that, they're basically clones. So yeah, I guess I'll go into how I made this. Let me turn these off. Let me actually take out oscillator 2 for now. So this is what it sounds like by default. And first, let's just take out the unison actually. So this is just a regular saw now. And notice how it has sort of this like undulating sort of pattern. I did that using LFOs. So if you look at this LFO, an LFO is basically an oscillator like these. It creates a waveform, but that waveform is used to modify these knobs instead of making sound. So mostly oscillators are usually used to make sound. And this sort of waveform is what you're hearing sort of along in the air, right? And at a very high frequency. But these low frequency oscillators, LFOs, are being used instead to modify these knobs, so you can sort of automate stuff like that. And I have this low frequency oscillator modifying the volume, which is called level here, of this saw. And you can see how it's making it sort of go up and down, right? So if I get rid of it, it doesn't do sort of the wobbly stuff, right? And here it does, and that's because it's going up and down sort of here. These envelopes are, you can think of them as these low frequency oscillators, but they only apply at the very beginning of the sound. So they basically play once at the beginning and they tell this thing what to do with knobs. Envelopes actually came first when these things were invented, I think, so they're meant for different purposes. Serum is very flexible. You can actually set your LFO to apply only at the beginning if you like, so they're sort of interchangeable. Of course, low frequency oscillators are more flexible, but originally with like old analog synths, these envelopes would not be able to, would be completely different from LFOs. Yeah, also just quick, if you don't know what envelopes are like, or how to sort of make these envelopes have different shapes, there's sort of 4 knobs. Not all synthesizers will have pictures like this, so this will be helpful to know. The attack sort of tells you, higher attack means the sound will start slower. So see how it's going up in volume because it's starting very low. Lower attack means it starts sort of at the top of its volume. Hold means how long you sort of hold the key for. So if you hold it for longer, it stays at its maximum volume for longer. And then decay is how long it takes for the sound to go from sort of max to 0 over time. And then there's also sustain, which means whether it actually ends or not at 0. So you can have it sustained sort of at some volume, and then it'll decay to that volume instead of 0. And you have release. Release is just sort of, it makes more sense if you have sustain. Once you sort of let go, once it reaches this point, it will sort of fade away slowly and sound a little bit like a mallet. But yeah, this is sort of the way I made this sound. I have all these LFOs doing different things. I have one LFO which is modifying, I don't think the first one's modifying anything, but the second one is modifying oscillator 1, and then oscillator 2 has another LFO which is set to basically sound like it's hitting. So you can see how this low attack makes it sound like it's hitting, whereas if you have long attack, it doesn't sound like it's hitting. So that's sort of a thing to think about when you're making synths in general. This is not super organized, but I hope that there are some interesting or useful tidbits from here. And here's a filter. So a filter will cut out frequencies either at the high or at the low or somewhere you specify. Here it's cutting out the highs. So if I were to remove the filter, you can hear how it's very high pitched, whereas if I put the filter back on, there isn't so much high pitch. have some effects here. I have a delay, and I have so the delay will basically, I don't know exactly what it does, but I think it just replays the sound basically over time in a sort of bouncy fashion. So that's the delay in action. There's also a chorus, which makes your thing sound a little bit softer, kind of underwater. I also don't know exactly what it does. And I have a reverb, and the reverb just makes it sound sort of like it's in a cathedral. So you see how there's sort of noise at the very high pitches? That sounds like airy, like air. That's the reverb. So this is sort of how you make this sound. And I encourage you to sort of just experiment and see what you can make. Just with like a saw, you can make all sorts of stuff, especially with Serum, since you can modify the waveform itself, and sort of get familiar with what you can do with saws. They usually have a very rich, sort of full sound, which is helpful if you want to make like a pad. So maybe let's actually go to the third one, which is a pad, and then we'll come back to the pluck. This is a pad. This is a bit, because it has a high cut, which is a low pass. High cut and low pass mean the same thing. It means you cut the high, keep the low. It sort of sounds like this, but if you remove the filter, it's going to be very loud. You're going to hear the high ends. So actually, one thing to note, if you know sort of about Fourier transforms, if you don't know what that is, you can sort of skip. Fine. But basically, Fourier transforms are a way of representing these waveforms. So these waveforms are in time. So over time, this is the volume, and this is at a very high frequency, and that's traveling through the air, and that's what you're hearing. You could also represent them as having frequency over time, or frequency over space, I think it is. So you have frequency to volume, and that can be over time. So it's like a 3D plot, but sort of at a snapshot, at a single moment, you can have different frequencies that are playing at different volumes, and if you add those things, you get a new wave, which can be, for example, a saw. So a saw is actually you get sine waves at multiple different frequencies. I think it's all the integer frequencies, and you add them. Basically, you get this big saw. But the point is, you have very high frequency sine waves, which is why when you have a saw, it has a lot of high end. So that's sort of something sort of interesting to note. Square waves, I think, have the odd or even numbers and all sorts of other things, but there's a lot of high end, and saws have the most high end, so that's something to know. Sometimes you'll also see some people throw in white noise. I haven't done that anywhere here, but if you throw in white noise, you can sort of get more of an air sound at the top of the frequency spectrum. Cool. There's not too much to share for this pad, but a pad, just long notes, legato notes, playing usually harmony while you have a melody at the top. That's what pads are meant to do. Usually you can think of it like strings in an orchestra. When the strings are playing, a slow sort of... If somebody dies, for example, they'll play something really slow, and then there'll be one voice or two voices that are singing something. And there's just kind of a background. That's what you use pads for. Supersaws are great for pads because they have such a because they have so much high end and such a sort of full sound. You can create a good ambience. So I've added a couple effects which I'm going to remove to show you just what like a regular supersaw here sounds like. Filter. So it doesn't sound that beautiful, but when you layer it with other stuff, it can be pretty good. Maybe. I'm gonna take it out so you can see the difference. So depending on what you're going for, maybe you want to have that fuller sound, and for that reason you might want to have a pad. I mainly just wanted to showcase a couple things which I think will be cool to know about, namely phasers. Here's like a phaser. I'm going to play without first. Regular supersaw with a phaser. Sounds like a spaceship is landing or something. Yeah, you can also do this with flangers. Basically, I think both of these, what they do more or less is they punch holes into the spectrum and they move them. So it sounds like some sort of sci-fi sound. Just wanted to kind of show this so you could have that on your mind. Maybe that's something you want to do. It also has a reverb, so no reverb. Reverb. Not too much of a difference, but it sounds sort of more round. Whereas before it was hitting a little bit too much, I think. Yeah, I'm gonna keep it like this, and I don't actually like the phaser that much, to be honest. But I thought it was cool to share. Plucks, sometimes you want like a melody sound like this. You hear this all the time. The way you get this to sound this way is you use an envelope that has a short attack and has sort of this decay, this quick decay, and you apply it on a low pass filter. So you could also just have this. But it hits kind of hard, right? So for that, you usually use this. So you have this envelope and you apply it on a cutoff. So it's basically doing this every time. So I mean, the point, I think the reason this sounds like, mallets that you might hear in real life is that the air is dampening the strings when you sort of hit them, and I think that corresponds to this sort of low pass action. But that's just my theory. I don't really know. But basically, when you hit, you get sort of more high end, and that makes it sound harder, and then it sort of fades away. And the way it sounds with the low pass is much more pluck-like than I think, just with an envelope. I don't think I've done anything too interesting with this one. I have a delay, and I have a compressor. So compressor just makes your thing louder, but it makes it louder in a very specific way. It makes it louder up to a point, but then it stops making it louder. Or it makes it louder by less after that point. The reason you might want to do that is because you'll just have more noise over time, and that more sound over time. That will, in general, that sounds better if you have no reason to not do that. So yeah, you can have compressors or not have compressors. But this is going to make the sort of the pattern of volume over time a little bit fatter. Like it's going to be louder, and then it's going to drop more suddenly, which makes sense for this pluck, I think, because you want it to be a bit harder hitting, so you can make a little bit more of a mid-range sound. A delay, I think I mentioned this before, but it sort of clones the voice and repeats it in this ping pong fashion. Here I have it really fast, 1/16, can also have it slower, like this. And that's sort of another option. The faster you go, obviously, it'll sound. You get sort of this type of sound. So depending on what you like, you can sort of go for one or the other. Maybe you can put these in triplets, or you can offset them by constant amounts. Those are other options. But yeah, the main takeaway from a pluck is if you want to do a pluck with saws or with whatever, modulate the cutoff with an envelope and have it go from a high cutoff to a low cutoff in a quick fashion. So now we can go to get to. Actually, no. There's one more interesting thing I want to share, but I don't know where it is. I'm looking. I think it might be for actually the first one. Oh, here it is. Okay. So we're gonna go back to our very first thing real quick. There's actually here. This is what it would sound like normally, but I have added an LFO that's modulating the fine tune of the second voice. I'm going to take out the first voice so you can hear this better. This is how it would normally sound. This is how it's going to sound with the modulation. See how the pitch is changing ever so slightly? And that sounds very sort of analog-like. That sounds old school. That's because analog synths, after a lot of usage, they usually lose their pitch. It's like a piano. Your piano becomes detuned, or another instrument, right? Like a string instrument. It'll become detuned. An analog synth will also become detuned. And that slight detuning actually sounds kind of pretty, I think. A lot of people, I think, tend to like it. So you can sort of simulate that if you're using a digital synth like this by modulating the fine tune. So fine tune is just like the pitch, but within a very small range. So it allows you to make very small sort of changes. So you can do stuff like this. So yeah, it gives it more of a cutesy, I think, sound. And of course the first one doesn't have that. So they're kind of in balance that way. So that fine tune idea, I actually use it for this lead, but I also do other things for this lead. First thing, I have this LFO, which I noted from before. I have it here on the second voice. But it sounds terrible, and that's because it's like changing by ton, and I have unison. It's like super detuned. But this is very soft. So the reason I have this is because I want this to give it sort of more of this sort of detuned sound. But I don't want this to be the main thing. So I guess I added this to augment sort of the main oscillator, which is this first oscillator. The first oscillator is kind of a regular saw. The envelope here you can see is like a pluck envelope, but it's applied on the sound itself. So here you can hear sort of how it sounds when you have an envelope like this applied to the volume directly. Sounds almost a little bit chiptune-like, but that was what I was going for. Here in Serum, you can control the bend amount of your waveform, which is basically to say this. You can just see this, see how it bends. You can control that. And that's cool, because when you have it fatter like this, it's going to sound more like a sine. It's going to sound softer. But if there's no bend, it'll sound a bit sharper. So I have it sort of here, sounding softer at the beginning and then getting sharper as time progresses, but the volume also gets lower, so that's something I thought sounded good. You can experiment with this. Serum has all sorts of different transformations you can apply. Yeah. But there's one interesting thing here, which I want you to notice, which is that I have monolegato. Or it looks like I only have mono. I'm gonna remove it. Look at this. This is how it would sound normally. And sometimes you want sort of these pitch bends when you change note. So for example, if I change a note here, it just sounds normal, right? But what if you want this? So the reason you might want that is, I mean, that's actually sort of how the human voice works. When people change notes, there's a little bit of a bend. This is commonly used, I think, for sort of trans, potentially for some feature bass, stuff where you're going to have a high lead. Sometimes you want this sort of thing. Makes it sound a little bit more like a human voice, which I think is interesting. So remember, if you want sort of this pitch bendy sound, you can obviously automate, but you can also do monolegato, and it will directly make your voice do this. I don't actually know what legato does, but I think mono plus always in Sierra does this. Portamento, I think it's called portamento, is the amount of pitch change. I think this scale thing, you can sort of change the ratio at which you change pitch, but I haven't used it in a long time, so I'm not sure. But yeah, these are things to keep in mind. If you want to make this sort of lead, definitely look at portamento, monolegato. That will be helpful if you want to be able to do pitch bends. Sometimes you may need the notes to overlap for the software to understand that it's supposed to pitch bend. But since I have always, it's going to always pitch bend. And that's a bunch of different sort of saw examples that we've just gone through. I guess in the last couple minutes, I'm just going to show you, I don't know, we can make a random supersaw pattern, completely unrelated. Oops. So here's just a regular supersaw with, let's put the max voices, 16 voices. A lot of synths only let you go up to 8, but Serum has a bunch of options. Excuse me. The unison, as I said, it's like you have one voice, and then you're going to create 16 copies of it, and then when you detune them, they're going to be set at ever slightly different pitches. So actually, you could imagine that you could do this with a fine tune. If you had 16 of these oscillators and you fine tune each of them slightly off from each other, you would get this sound. But this is such a common application, basically using a bunch of saw voices in unison and detuning them, that basically every synthesizer you use will have this baked in, and you'll be able to do this sort of stuff. Let's note one more thing. Phase, or rand actually is what actually phase and rand. Phase tells it where to start on the waveform. You probably will never care about this. I've never had to care about this. But basically, when you hit the key, where does it start? It could start in the middle here, or it could start at the end, or somewhere anywhere else, right? So that's up to you. Just leave it default. You can't really hear any differences. Like, they all sound the same to me, but that's something you can play around with. If you modulate the phase, maybe you can get something sounding interesting, because the notes will sort of start to hit each other in a way. But yeah, that's something you can look into. Rand changes where also changes the phase, but for different voices. So different voices start at different positions in the phase, randomly. Then you can decide where that can be. So maybe it can only be here in this sort of yellow square. So it can't happen here on the left. It can only happen in the square, rectangle, or you can let it be anywhere. So you have one voice. It sounds different from what it sounds like when you have multiple voices, and that's because they're randomly starting at different phases. So if you remove rand, it'll sound like one louder voice. Just sounds like one louder voice. If you add rand, now they don't sound, it doesn't sound like one voice. And of course, if you detune, then you can really tell. And this is what you're going for usually. Sometimes you do want actually for it to sound more like one voice. Maybe you like it a little bit tighter. So this might make more sense for some sort of feature-based lead. Sometimes you might want it wider. That might be good for a pad. That's a bit much, but up to you. Wavetable position is primarily if you are in Serum. Serum has a bunch of waves in single tables, and you can select which one you want. Sometimes they're continuous, so it's like you change the wave, and ever so slightly it'll modify it. So you can actually do cool effects like this. See how it sort of warps. This is a sine, of course, but that's something you can do with Serum. But I guess going back to saws, these are Supersaws. They are important. I hope this was useful to learn about how to make things with saws and Supersaws. I'm going to, let's make a random 4-bar thing, and then let's just call it a day. So if you're making feature bass or drum and bass, 160 BPM is usually a good speed. another example of what you can do with Supersaws. So yeah, that sounds a little bit feature basy. And yeah, this is all with saws, only saws and nothing else. So I think that's definitely quite exciting. A lot you can do with saws. I hope you guys learned something from this video. Thanks for watching. See you later.